For week 7, and just as a reminder, the reading assignments are Chapter 14 and corresponding to the text chapter assigned, the supplemental treatment provided by the Notes to Syllabus document. You don't have to hand in the following assignment, but you are expected to work through the Chapter 14 end of chapter technical questions and even numbered application questions to ensure thorough preparation for the examination that will be administered. As you know, the text provides solutions to the previously identified even-numbered questions, so you can readily check to see that you are on the right track when addressing these questions. As part of the weekly assignment, remember you should select and be prepared to discuss a current business or economic event, reported or analyzed by a prominent national publication, that reflects a relationship presented by the reading assignment. A summary of this week's topics begins with establishing the distinction between a market demand curve and an aggregate demand curve, as well as the distinction between a market supply curve and an aggregate supply curve. As examples, changes in the aggregate price level, holding all other factors unchanged, result in movement along the aggregate demand curve. For a closed economy, changes in consumption, physical investment, and government spending, holding all other factors unchanged, result in a shift of the aggregate demand curve. On a related subject, the short-run aggregate supply curve is treated as upward sloping, whereas the long-run aggregate supply curve is assumed to be vertical. With respect to changes in government spending, the manner in which the U.S. federal budget is established bears scrutiny. For example, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are examples of non-discretionary federal expenditures. The bulk of defense spending falls under the discretionary federal expenditure category. Identifying regressive and progressive areas of the tax code also is important. For tax year 2019, and as an example, individuals receiving wage income from an employer in the amount of $132,900 or less are subject to a 7.65% FICA tax. Thus, an employee earning $75,000 a year pays a $5,737 FICA tax. An employee earning $1 million a year pays a $10,166 FICA tax. The FICA tax rate on the $75,000 wage earner is 7.65%. The FICA tax on the $1 million wage earner is 1%. A framework of analysis establishing implications associated with the dynamic interaction of aggregate supply and demand curves provides insight into historical macroeconomic outcomes and, more importantly, insight into what expected outcomes would be in relation to fiscal and monetary actions implemented by government policymakers. Events surrounding the Great Depression can be readily interpreted based on aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis, but we have a more recent classic example that provides similar insight. As I have stated elsewhere, the last U.S. recession, December 2007 to June 2009, was the most severe U.S. economic downturn since the Great Depression. The initial catalyst for this economic downturn was the collapse of the U.S. residential housing market, and this collapse spilled over into the U.S. financial markets and subsequently to world financial markets. The financial crisis could not have occurred in the absence of adequate government regulation and oversight, a failure that threatened the U.S. and global economies with catastrophic collapse. The decades-long trend towards deregulation of the U.S. financial services industry ensured that adequate government regulation and oversight were not present. There is no debate among reputable economists that a complete collapse of the U.S. economy was forestalled by federal government intervention. The details of this intervention will follow in a moment. Let's first consider the origin of major structural imbalances in the federal budget leading into the Great Recession. Keep in mind that in year 2000, The Congressional Budget Office forecast that the public debt of the United States would be eliminated by year 2010 if the fiscal policies then in place were continued. Suffice it to say, they weren't. The major causes underlying structuralized U.S. federal budget deficits and the rising national debt are the unfunded wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001, the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003, and the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act, also of 2003. The year 2008 financial crisis, recession, and subsequent tepid economic recovery also widened the federal budget deficit. To forestall a second Great Depression, the October 2008 Troubled Asset Relief Program and American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in February 2009 were implemented. These emergency programs also contributed to federal budget deficits incurred at the time and to the national debt. In what phases of the business cycle is it appropriate to apply stimulative fiscal monetary policies, and when is it not appropriate? The paradox of thrift concept is informative in this regard. When there is a significant economic downturn, people are losing their jobs, and many people who don't lose their jobs are fearful that they will be next to be laid off. Accordingly, it would be entirely irrational for consumers who are still working to spend on the same basis as would be the case if they had a high degree of confidence in their future earnings prospects. Obviously, those who have lost their jobs cannot spend as freely as they did while they were employed. With household spending on the decline, businesses in the aggregate experienced weakened demand for their products and services. Under these circumstances, it would be irrational for businesses to spend on inventory and to hire workers on the same basis as occurred during better economic times. These outcomes are entirely rational consequences of a severe economic downturn, a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Under such circumstances, we cannot expect households and businesses to act in any manner other than a manner consistent with the behaviors described. The problem which inescapably emerges is that these cutbacks in spending can only be expected to generate a downward cycle in economic activity. Reduced demand for business products and services will inevitably result in job losses, curtail hiring plans, and result in stagnated wage gains. In turn, household incomes will fall, and falling household income will further reduce demand for business products and services, and the cycle repeats itself. Federal budget deficits widen during an economic downturn as a consequence of falling tax collections. So efforts to achieve budget balance by cutting federal government spending, a component of the aggregate demand function, exacerbate the severity of the economic downturn. Under these circumstances, only the federal government has the resources and power, through its implementation of stimulative monetary and fiscal policies, to reverse this downward trend in the business cycle. In the short run, expansionary fiscal policy will widen federal budget deficits, but in the long run, restoration of federal budget balance, or an outcome approaching federal budget balance, cannot realistically be expected until conditions approaching full employment and healthy GDP growth are achieved. To combat the Great Recession, the administration of President Bush proposed and obtained in year 2008 congressional approval for the fiscal stimulus represented by the TARP. In 2009, the administration of President Obama proposed and obtained congressional approval for the fiscal stimulus represented by the ARRA. In conjunction with the expansionary monetary policy implemented by the Federal Reserve, led by Chairman Ben Bernanke, a second Great Depression was averted, and based on considerable empirical research after the fact, this is the consensus view among reputable economists. In the context of an aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework of analysis, stimulative fiscal and monetary policies lifted the U.S. out of its economic doldrums. While a good many decades-long problems remain, rising income distributional imbalances, for example, the worst potential outcome was averted. One caution: we shouldn't draw the wrong inference from the previous assessment. Stimulative monetary and fiscal policies are not appropriate when the economy is operating at its full employment output capability. In the context of an aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework of analysis, such stimulative policies can be counted on to spur inflationary pressures with little effect on employment and output. The federal budget imbalances that result can be counted on, if history is any guide, to impair the will required to initiate the appropriate macroeconomic policies when the inevitable future economic downturn is encountered.